At 12:55 a.m. on February 3, 1943, a single torpedo struck the USAT Dorchester amidships on the starboard side. The explosion killed the men nearest the impact instantly. Those sleeping in the berthing compartments, one deck above, felt the entire ship lurch sideways, throwing bodies from bunks, sending equipment crashing across steel decks. The lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered, failed, returned at half power. The Dorchester was 150 miles south of Greenland, carrying 902 American servicemen, merchant seamen, and civilian workers through the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. Among those 902 men were 4 Army chaplains. Lieutenant George L. Fox, Methodist minister, age 42. He had served as a medical corps assistant in France during the First World War, enlisting at 17 by lying about his age. He had seen men die before. Lieutenant Alexander D. Goode, rabbi, age 32. He held a doctorate in philosophy from Johns Hopkins University. Before the war, he had led a congregation in York, Pennsylvania, and written academic papers on interfaith cooperation. Lieutenant John P. Washington, Catholic priest, age 34. He had grown up in Newark, New Jersey, the son of Irish immigrants. He had joined the Chaplain Corps because he believed a priest's place was with men facing death. Lieutenant Clark Viv Poling, Dutch Reformed minister, age 32. His father was a prominent clergyman. He had requested frontline duty specifically, asking the Army not to assign him to a safe post simply because he was a minister's son. 4 chaplains, 4 faiths. They had met aboard the Dorchester 3 days earlier when the convoy departed St. John's, Newfoundland. The crossing to Greenland typically took 5 days. They were not going to make it. The Dorchester was no warship. She had been built in 1926 as a luxury passenger liner for the Merchants and Miners Transportation Company, running routes along the American East Coast from Boston to Miami. Her original capacity was 314 passengers in comfortable staterooms. The Army had requisitioned her in 1942, stripped her cabins, installed tiered bunks, and crammed 902 men into spaces designed for less than a third that number. Now she was part of convoy SG-19, 3 troop ships escorted by 3 Coast Guard cutters, the Tampa, the Escanaba, and the Comanche. The convoy had been warned. German submarine activity had been detected along their route. At 21:30 hours the previous night, 3 hours before the attack, Captain Hans J. Danielson had ordered all men to sleep fully dressed with life jackets on. Most had ignored the order. The berthing compartments below decks were stifling hot from the packed bodies and the ship's boilers. Men had stripped to their underwear. They had removed their life jackets and hung them on bunk posts or stuffed them in their duffel bags. They had done what exhausted soldiers always did, prioritized sleep over safety. At 12:55 a.m., they paid for that decision. The torpedo that struck the Dorchester was one of 3 fired by U-223, a Type 7 IC submarine commanded by Oberleutnant Karl-Jürg Wächter. He was 24 years old. The U-223 had been stalking convoy SG-19 for hours, maneuvering into attack position in the darkness. Wächter had fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at the largest target in the convoy. 2 missed. 1 did not. The T-3 torpedo, a battery-powered, wakeless torpedo designed to avoid detection, struck the Dorchester at the waterline between the engine room and the No. 2 cargo hold. The 280-kilogram warhead detonated on contact, ripping a hole in the hull 30 feet wide. Seawater at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected man in 20 minutes, poured into the ship at thousands of gallons per second. The engine room flooded immediately. The men stationed there died at their posts or were swept into the machinery by the incoming sea. The ship's electrical system failed within 40 seconds, plunging most of the vessel into total darkness. In the berthing compartments, men woke to chaos. Steel groaned. The deck tilted. Emergency klaxons blared for 15 seconds and then went silent as their power supply shorted out. In the pitch black, soldiers scrambled for equipment they could not find, searched for life jackets they had removed hours earlier, fought toward ladders and hatches they could not see. The passageways filled with smoke from electrical fires. The air tasted like burning rubber and diesel fuel. Above, on the open deck, those men already topside understood what the soldiers below did not yet know. The Dorchester was going down. Lieutenant George Fox was in his cabin when the torpedo hit. The impact threw him from his bunk into the opposite bulkhead. He felt his shoulders strike metal, heard something crack, the wooden frame of his cot, not bone, and found himself on the deck in darkness. Fox did not panic. He had been here before, not on a sinking ship, but in the chaos that follows sudden violence. In 1918, at the Meuse Argonne, he had served as a medical assistant treating wounded men while artillery shells cratered the ground around him. He was not a young man anymore. He was 42 years old, gray at the temples, slower than he had been. But he knew what panic did to men, and he knew the antidote. He found his life jacket in the dark, put it on, secured the straps. Then he opened his cabin door and stepped into the passageway. The smoke was already thickening. He could hear men shouting below, some in terror, some calling for help, some simply screaming. The Dorchester was listing to starboard. Fox braced himself against the tilting deck and began moving toward the nearest ladder. Somewhere in the darkness of that same passageway, the other 3 chaplains were doing the same thing. They found each other on the main deck within minutes of the explosion. Fox, Goode, Washington, Poling, 4 men from 4 different faiths who had known each other barely 72 hours, stood in the chaos of a dying ship and made a decision without speaking it aloud. They would not leave. They would not take a place in a lifeboat. They would stay and do the only work that mattered now. Around them, the scene was medieval. The Dorchester's deck was covered in a skin of ice from the frozen spray of the North Atlantic. Men stumbled across it in bare feet and slipped, crashing into railings and each other. Many had made it topside without life jackets. Some wore only their underwear, their uniforms left behind in flooded compartments. The cold was already killing them, not yet the water, just the wind. 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, with wind chill. Exposed skin began freezing within 30 seconds. The lifeboats were the immediate problem. The Dorchester carried 14 wooden lifeboats and several life rafts, but the davits, the mechanical arms that lowered the boats, were coated in ice. Some had frozen solid. Men hacked at the ice with knives and rifle butts, but every second spent freeing a lifeboat was a second the ship sank lower, and the ship was sinking fast. Within 4 minutes of the torpedo impact, the Dorchester had taken on enough water to develop a pronounced list to starboard. Her bow was settling. Her stern was rising. The entire geometry of the deck was changing, becoming a slope that made every movement treacherous. The 4 chaplains looked at each other across that icy deck. Then they went to work. The Dorchester had 27 minutes to live. No one aboard knew that number yet. But they understood the mathematics of their situation. Water coming in faster than pumps could remove it. List increasing with every passing minute. 902 men competing for lifeboat seats designed to hold perhaps 400. At 12:59 a.m., 4 minutes after the torpedo strike, the 4 chaplains split into pairs. Fox and Goode moved toward the port side. Washington and Poling headed starboard toward the impact point, toward the compartments already flooding. They did not discuss theology. They did not pray together. There would be time for that later, in the final minutes. Right now, they had work to do. Private First Class William B. Bednar was 19 years old. He had been sleeping in a compartment on the second deck when the torpedo hit. The explosion had ruptured a steam pipe somewhere nearby. He could hear the hissing, feel the heat mixing with the cold water already pooling on the deck plates. In the darkness, he could not find his life jacket. He could not find the ladder. He could not find anything except other panicking men, all of them pushing in different directions, all of them shouting. Then a hand gripped his shoulder. "This way, son." The voice was calm, impossibly calm given what was happening around them. "The ladder is 15 feet to your left. Follow my voice." Bednar did not know who was speaking. He could not see the man's face. He only felt the hand on his shoulder, guiding him through the darkness, and heard the voice, steady, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. "There's the ladder. Climb. Don't stop for anything. Get to the main deck. Find a life jacket. Get in a lifeboat if you can. Swim if you can't. Just get off this ship." Bednar climbed. He made it topside. He survived the night. He would later learn that the man who saved him was Lieutenant John Washington, the Catholic priest from Newark who had entered a flooding compartment in total darkness to lead men out. Below decks, the Dorchester was becoming a death trap. The torpedo had struck between the engine room and the No. 2 cargo hold, but the flooding was spreading. Seawater found every crack, every unsealed hatch, every passageway that sloped toward the damaged section. The ship's internal bulkheads, the watertight walls designed to contain flooding, had not been fully sealed. Doors that should have been locked were open. Hatches that should have been dogged were loose. The men had grown complacent during 3 days of uneventful sailing. That complacency was now killing them. By 1:02 a.m., 7 minutes after the torpedo strike, the flooding had reached compartments 200 feet from the impact point. Men who had survived the initial explosion drowned in their bunks as water rose faster than they could escape. The darkness made everything worse. Ladders became bottlenecks. Stronger men climbed over weaker men. Some men froze in place, unable to move, unable to think, their minds shutting down from shock and terror. The chaplains moved against this tide of panic. Lieutenant Clark Poling found a cluster of soldiers trapped in a berthing compartment on the starboard side. The only exit, a ladder leading to an overhead hatch, was jammed. Men were pounding on it from below, screaming for help. The water was at their knees. Poling climbed down a different ladder, worked his way through a flooding passageway with water up to his chest, and reached them from the opposite direction. "There's another way out," he told them. "Follow me, single file, no pushing. Everyone is getting out of here." He led 11 men through the freezing water to a secondary ladder. All 11 survived. On the main deck, the scene had shifted from chaos to something approaching organized desperation. The crew of the Dorchester, the merchant seamen who operated the ship, were fighting to launch the lifeboats. Some boats had already gone over the side, but the mechanisms were failing. The ice was too thick. The list was too severe. Several lifeboats launched only to capsize immediately, spilling their passengers into the 34-degree water. Other boats hung from single davits, swinging wildly, smashing against the hull. Captain Hans Danielson was on the bridge, or what remained of it. The explosion had knocked out communications. He had no way to signal the convoy escorts, the Tampa, the Escanaba, the Comanche, for assistance. The escorts were maintaining their positions around the convoy, hunting for the submarine that had attacked them. They did not yet understand how quickly the Dorchester was sinking. Danielson understood. He had been a merchant captain for 22 years. He knew what a 30-foot hole in the hull meant. He knew what a 15-degree list at 7 minutes meant. He was watching his ship die, and he was doing the calculus that every captain dreads. How many men could he save in the time remaining? The answer was not 9:02. Lieutenant George Fox found the first life jacket locker at 1:04 a.m., 9 minutes after the torpedo strike. The locker was on the main deck, port side, near the number 3 lifeboat station. It was supposed to contain 72 life jackets. Fox broke the latch with a fire axe, swung the door open, and began pulling out life jackets. Rabbi Alexander Goode was beside him within seconds. The 2 men worked without speaking, Fox pulling life jackets from the locker, Goode distributing them to the soldiers gathering around them. The men were desperate, grabbing, reaching over each other. Some were crying, some were praying, some were silent, their faces blank with shock. "One at a time," Goode called out. His voice carried the cadence of a man accustomed to leading congregations, clear, authoritative, calm. "Everyone will get one. Form a line, one at a time." The line formed, not because the soldiers were disciplined, they were terrified, but because in that moment, a voice of authority was the only thing standing between them and pure animal panic. They lined up because a man in a chaplain's uniform told them to, and because obeying him felt like the only sane action in an insane situation. 72 life jackets. Fox counted them as they went out. 72 men saved, or at least given a chance at survival. Then the locker was empty. There were still hundreds of men without life jackets. The convoy escorts finally understood the situation at approximately 1:06 a.m. The Comanche, a 165-foot Coast Guard cutter under the command of Lieutenant Commander Ralph Curry, spotted the Dorchester's distress signal. A single red flare fired from the sinking ship's deck. Curry immediately ordered full speed toward the transport. The Comanche's maximum speed was 13 knots. The Dorchester was roughly 2 miles away. At 13 knots, the Comanche would reach the sinking ship in approximately 9 minutes. The Dorchester had perhaps 18 minutes left. The math was brutal. Even if Curry arrived in time, even if the Comanche's crew worked with perfect efficiency, they could not rescue 902 men from a sinking ship in the middle of a submarine attack. The Comanche's own survival was not guaranteed. U-223 was still out there, possibly lining up another shot. Standard convoy doctrine required escorts to prioritize protecting the remaining ships over rescuing survivors. Curry made a decision. He would violate doctrine. He would risk his own ship and crew to save as many men as possible from the Dorchester. The Escanaba was already moving as well, her captain making the same calculation. The Tampa held her position, continuing to hunt the submarine. 3 cutters, 3 captains, each making the choices that would determine who lived and who died in the next 20 minutes. At 1:08 a.m., 13 minutes after the torpedo strike, the Dorchester's list reached 20 degrees. This was the tipping point. A ship listing at 20 degrees becomes nearly impossible to walk on. The deck becomes a slope. Anything not secured slides toward the low side. Men who lost their footing tumbled across the icy deck and crashed into railings, equipment, each other. Some went over the side. The lifeboats still attached to the ship were now useless on the port side, the high side. The davits pointed toward the sky instead of toward the water. Launching was impossible. On the starboard side, the low side, the remaining boats hung so close to the rising water that they flooded before they could be fully loaded. Father John Washington was at the starboard rail, helping soldiers over the side and into the water. There was no time for lifeboats now. The only chance was to jump and swim. Swim away from the ship before she rolled. Swim toward the Coast Guard cutters that were racing to rescue them. Swim and pray that the cold did not kill them before help arrived. "You can make it," Washington told each man before they went over. "The cutters are coming. Swim toward the lights. Don't stop swimming. God is with you." Some of the men were Catholic. They asked for absolution before they jumped. Washington gave it. Rapid blessings, a few words of Latin, the sign of the cross. Protestant soldiers asked for prayers. He prayed with them too. Jewish soldiers asked for nothing but looked at him with desperate eyes. He blessed them anyway, in words that had no denomination, only faith. God is with you. Swim. Don't stop. Men jumped. Men swam. Men died within minutes, their bodies shutting down in the 34-degree water, their life jackets keeping their corpses afloat as the cold stopped their hearts. Washington stayed at the rail. At 1:10 a.m., 15 minutes after the torpedo strike, the 4 chaplains found the second life jacket locker. It was on the starboard side, near the stern, in a compartment that was still above the waterline. Fox, Goode, Washington, and Poling converged on it from different directions, each of them having worked their way through the dying ship, helping men escape. They had not coordinated this meeting. They simply arrived at the same place at the same time, drawn by the same understanding. There had to be more life jackets somewhere. Poling broke the latch. Fox pulled the door open. The locker was half empty. Someone had already been here, either crew members distributing life jackets in the first minutes after the attack, or soldiers who had grabbed what they could and run. 31 life jackets remained. Fox counted them quickly, his lips moving. 31 life jackets. Hundreds of men still on the deck, hundreds more in the water without flotation. The chaplains looked at each other. Then they began handing out the life jackets, one at a time. Calm voices, steady hands. 31 men saved. When the locker was empty, they closed the door. There were no more life jacket lockers. There were no more life jackets anywhere on the Dorchester. None that could be reached, none that were not already underwater in flooded compartments or on the bodies of men already dead. The 4 chaplains still wore their own life jackets. They had put them on in their cabins minutes after the torpedo hit, following the most basic rule of survival: secure your own safety before helping others. That rule was about to be broken. At 1:12 a.m., 17 minutes after the torpedo strike, Sergeant Grady Clark found himself at the stern rail without a life jacket. Clark was 23 years old, a farm boy from central Missouri who had never seen the ocean before joining the Army. He had been sleeping in a compartment on the 3rd deck when the torpedo hit. The explosion had thrown him from his bunk. In the darkness, he had grabbed what he thought was his life jacket, but it turned out to be his duffel bag. By the time he realized his mistake, the water was at his ankles. He dropped the bag and ran. Now he stood at the rail, watching men jump into the black water below. Some wore life jackets, some did not. Those without jackets swam for a few minutes, then stopped swimming, then floated motionless, their heads slipping below the surface. The water was so cold that Clark could feel it through the deck plates beneath his feet. A bone-deep chill radiating upward, a preview of what waited below. He was going to have to jump. The ship was going down. But without a life jacket, jumping was just a slower form of drowning. "Soldier." Clark turned. A man in a chaplain's uniform was walking toward him, walking, not running, as if they were on a Sunday stroll instead of a sinking ship. The chaplain's face was calm. His eyes were steady. He held a life jacket in his outstretched hand. "Put this on," the chaplain said. "The straps go over your shoulders. Buckle them tight across your chest. The jacket will keep your head above water even if you lose consciousness. Clark took the life jacket. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely work the straps. The chaplain helped him, adjusting the fit, checking the buckles, his movements quick and practiced. "Now, get over the side," the chaplain said. "Swim away from the ship, at least 50 yards. When she goes down, she'll create suction. You don't want to be close when that happens." "What about you?" Clark asked. The chaplain smiled. It was a strange expression on a dying ship, peaceful, almost serene. "I'll be fine," he said. "Go. Now." Clark went. He survived. Years later, he would identify the man who saved him as Lieutenant Clark Poling, the Dutch Reformed minister who had requested frontline duty because he believed that was where God needed him. The mathematics of the Dorchester's final minutes were merciless. 902 men had been aboard when the torpedo struck. By 1:12 a.m., approximately 180 had made it into lifeboats or life rafts. Another 200 were in the water, some with life jackets, some without. Perhaps 150 were already dead. Killed in the initial explosion, drowned in flooded compartments, frozen in the water, crushed by falling equipment or capsizing lifeboats. That left roughly 370 men still on the ship. The deck was crowded with them. Soldiers, merchant seamen, civilian workers, all of them searching for life jackets, searching for lifeboats, searching for any chance at survival. There were no more life jackets to find. The Dorchester had carried life jackets for every man aboard, more than 900 of them, stored in lockers throughout the ship. But the torpedo had struck in the worst possible location. The explosion had ruptured the hull near the main life jacket storage compartment on the second deck. That compartment had flooded within 90 seconds of the impact. More than 400 life jackets, nearly half the ship's supply, had been underwater before most men even understood what was happening. The remaining life jackets had been scattered across the ship in secondary lockers, emergency stations, and individual cabins. Some men had grabbed them immediately. Others had distributed them in the first chaotic minutes. By now, 17 minutes into the sinking, every accessible life jacket had been claimed. Except 4. The 4 chaplains understood the situation before anyone else on the deck. They had been moving through the ship since the torpedo struck, pulling men from flooded compartments, directing traffic toward ladders and exits, distributing life jackets from every locker they could find. They had emptied the port side locker near Lifeboat Station 3, 72 life jackets. They had emptied the stern locker on the starboard side, 31 life jackets. They had found smaller caches in crew quarters and officer country, handing out another 40 or 50 jackets one by one. Now there was nothing left to hand out. Lieutenant George Fox stood near the stern, watching men search frantically through storage bins that had already been emptied. He could see the desperation in their movements, the way they threw aside equipment, tore open cabinets, dug through piles of debris. They were looking for something that no longer existed. Rabbi Alexander Goode was beside him. The 2 men had worked together for the past 15 minutes, a Methodist minister and a Jewish rabbi moving through a dying ship in perfect coordination. They had not discussed theology or denomination. They had simply done what needed to be done, trusting each other completely. "There's nothing left," Goode said quietly. He was not asking a question. "No," Fox replied. "Nothing." Father John Washington joined them a moment later, climbing up from a lower deck where he had been helping men reach the main level. His uniform was soaked. He had been waist-deep in seawater at some point, pulling soldiers out of a flooding passageway. Ice was already forming on his coat. "The lockers below are underwater," Washington reported. "All of them. I couldn't get to any of them." Lieutenant Clark Poling arrived last. He was breathing hard, his face flushed despite the cold. He had been at the opposite end of the ship, near the bow, where the flooding was worst. The men he had tried to help there were beyond helping now. "There are still men on deck without jackets," Poling said. "Dozens of them, maybe more." The four chaplains looked at each other. The Dorchester lurched beneath them. Her list had increased again, 25 degrees now, maybe more. The stern was rising as the bow sank deeper. Time was running out. Not minutes remaining, seconds. Around them, soldiers were beginning to panic in a new way. The organized desperation of the first 15 minutes was breaking down. Men were fighting over life jackets, pulling them off each other's bodies. One soldier had grabbed another man's jacket and refused to let go. The two of them were wrestling on the icy deck, neither willing to release his grip on the only thing that might save his life. Fox moved toward them. His voice cut through the chaos, not loud but commanding. "Stop, both of you, stop." The soldiers looked up. They saw the cross on Fox's collar. They stopped. "There are more life jackets," Fox said. He was lying. There were no more life jackets, except the ones the chaplains wore. But the lie served a purpose. It gave the soldiers something to hope for, something other than fighting each other to the death. "Where?" one of the soldiers demanded. "Where are they?" Fox pointed toward the stern. "Storage compartment near the number 4 lifeboat station. Go, both of you. There's enough for everyone." The soldiers ran. They would not find any life jackets there. But by the time they discovered the truth, the chaplains would have done what needed to be done. At 1:15 a.m., 20 minutes after the torpedo strike, the Dorchester's bow dipped below the waterline. The ship was dying. Everyone aboard could feel it now, the increasing tilt, the groaning of overstressed steel, the way the deck seemed to drop beneath their feet with each passing wave. Men were going over the side in waves, jumping rather than waiting to be pulled down with the ship. The water around the Dorchester was filled with swimmers, most of them struggling, many of them failing. The cold was killing them faster than they could swim. Life jackets kept heads above water, but did nothing to prevent hypothermia. Men who had jumped with perfect form, with life jackets properly secured, were dying within 10 minutes of hitting the water. The Coast Guard cutters were closing. The Comanche was less than half a mile away now. Her searchlights sweeping the water, her crew preparing to pull survivors from the sea. But half a mile was still too far for the men who were freezing to death. And on the deck of the Dorchester, 4 chaplains faced a choice. They had life jackets. 4 life jackets. The ones they had put on in their cabins in the first minute after the torpedo struck. 4 life jackets that could keep 4 men alive long enough for the cutters to reach them. They were those 4 men. They could survive. They could go over the side with their life jackets secured, swim away from the sinking ship, wait for rescue. They were strong enough, young enough. Well, Fox was 42, but he was tough. They could make it. But if they kept their life jackets, 4 soldiers would die instead. The mathematics were simple. 4 life jackets. 4 soldiers without them. 4 chaplains who had spent the last 20 minutes telling other men that God was with them, that help was coming, that they should have faith. What did faith look like now? If you want to see how these 4 chaplains answered that question and what happened in the final 7 minutes of the Dorchester, hit that subscribe button right now. It tells YouTube to share these stories with more people who need to hear them. Lieutenant George Fox moved first. He walked toward a young soldier standing at the rail, a private first class, barely 20 years old, shivering so violently that he could not control his limbs. The soldier was staring at the water below, unable to move. He had no life jacket. Fox stopped in front of him. "What's your name, son?" "Martinez," the soldier stammered. "Private Martinez." "Private Martinez," Fox said. "I need you to put this on." And then Lieutenant George Fox, Methodist minister, veteran of the First World War, 42 years old with a wife and 2 children waiting for him in Vermont, reached up and unbuckled his own life jacket. Private Martinez stared at the life jacket in Fox's hands. He did not understand what was happening. His mind, slowed by cold and terror, could not process the image in front of him. An officer, a chaplain, removing his only chance at survival and offering it to an enlisted man he had never met. "I can't," Martinez started. "You can," Fox said. "You will. Put it on. That's an order." The word order cut through the fog. Martinez was a soldier. He understood orders. His hands came up automatically, taking the life jacket, working the straps over his shoulders. Fox helped him, adjusting the fit the same way he had adjusted the fit for a dozen other soldiers in the past 20 minutes. His movements were quick and efficient. No hesitation, no trembling. "Over the side," Fox said. "Swim away from the ship, 50 yards at least. The cutters are coming. You're going to make it." Martinez looked at Fox's chest, at the empty space where the life jacket had been. The chaplain's uniform coat hung loose now, nothing beneath it but wool and cotton. No flotation, no protection, nothing. "Chaplain, go, son." Fox's voice was gentle. "I'll be fine. Go." Martinez went. He climbed over the rail. He dropped into the black water. He swam. He survived. George Fox turned back toward the chaos of the deck and began looking for another soldier without a life jacket. Rabbi Alexander Goode found his soldier near the number 3 lifeboat station. The man was older than most of the soldiers on the Dorchester, mid-30s, with the weathered face of someone who had worked outdoors his whole life. He was a civilian worker, one of the construction specialists being transported to Greenland to work on military installations. He had no military training. He had no idea how to survive a sinking ship. He was standing near an empty lifeboat davit, gripping the frozen metal with both hands, unable to move. Goode approached him slowly, the way you approach a frightened animal. "What's your name?" The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes were fixed on the water below, the dark water filled with floating bodies, some moving, some still. "Look at me," Goode said. "Look at my face. What's your name?" The man's gaze shifted. He focused on Goode's face, on the calm expression, the steady eyes. "Henderson," he managed. "Bill Henderson." "Bill," Goode said, "I'm going to give you my life jacket. You're going to put it on. Then you're going to jump into the water and swim toward those lights." He pointed toward the Comanche's searchlights, sweeping across the water less than a quarter-mile away. "Can you do that?" Henderson shook his head. "I can't swim. I never learned. I grew up in Kansas. There wasn't—" "You don't need to swim," Goode said. He was already unbuckling his life jacket, pulling it over his head. "The jacket will keep you afloat. Just kick your legs. Move toward the lights. The Coast Guard will pick you up." He held out the life jacket. Henderson stared at it. "This is yours," Henderson said. "You need this." "I need you to survive," Goode replied. "That's what I need. Put it on." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty, the complete absence of fear, broke through Henderson's paralysis. He took the life jacket. He put it on. Goode checked the straps, tightened the chest buckle, nodded once. "Go, now, before the ship rolls." Henderson went over the side. He did not swim well. His kicks were uncoordinated, his arms flailing. But the life jacket kept his head above water. He made it to the Comanche. He survived. Rabbi Alexander Goode, age 32, doctorate from Johns Hopkins, husband and father of one daughter, watched him go. Then he turned to look for another soldier who needed help. Father John Washington did not give his life jacket to a stranger. He gave it to a young man named Michael Warish, a Catholic boy from Pennsylvania who had served as an altar boy in his parish church before the war. Washington had heard Warish's confession 3 days earlier, aboard the Dorchester during the calm crossing from Newfoundland. He knew that Warish was terrified of dying. He knew that Warish had a girl back home he wanted to marry. He knew that Warish was 19 years old and should have had another 60 years of life ahead of him. Washington found Warish at the starboard rail, standing in a cluster of men without life jackets. They were all staring at the water, all frozen by the same terrible calculation. Jump without a life jacket and die in minutes, or stay on the ship and die when she went under. There was no good option, only bad options and worse options. Washington pushed through the cluster until he reached Warish. "Michael." Warish turned. His face was pale, his lips already blue from the cold. When he saw Washington, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, of hope. "Father, I'm giving you my life jacket," Washington said. He was already removing it, pulling the straps over his head. "Don't argue, don't thank me. Just put it on and get off this ship." "Father, I can't take Michael." Washington's voice was sharp. "I heard your confession. I know what's in your heart. You have a life to live. You have a girl to marry. You have children to raise and grandchildren to meet. This is not where your story ends." He pressed the life jacket into Warish's hands. The young man's fingers closed around it automatically. "What about you?" Warish asked. His voice cracked. "What about your story?" Washington smiled. It was the same smile he had worn 1,000 times in the confessional. The smile that said everything would be forgiven, everything would be all right. "My story's almost finished," he said. "Yours is just beginning. Go." Warish put on the life jacket. He went over the rail. He swam toward the lights. He survived the war. He married his girl. He had children and grandchildren. He lived until 2001, dying at the age of 77. 58 years after a priest from Newark gave him those extra decades as a gift. Father John Washington watched him go. Then he walked back toward the center of the deck, where the other chaplains were gathering. Lieutenant Clark Poling gave his life jacket to a man whose name he never learned. The soldier was unconscious, or nearly so. He had been struck by falling debris when one of the lifeboat davits collapsed, and he lay crumpled against the base of a cargo crane, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. He was breathing, but his eyes were closed. He had no life jacket. Poling knelt beside him. He checked the soldier's pulse, weak but present. He checked the head wound, ugly but not fatal, probably a concussion. The soldier would survive if he could get off the ship and into a rescue craft. But he could not get off the ship on his own. Poling looked around. The deck was nearly empty now. Most of the men had gone over the side, with or without life jackets. The Dorchester's list was approaching 30 degrees. Her bow was completely submerged. The stern was rising out of the water, her propeller visible for the first time since she left Newfoundland. There was no one to help. No one to carry this unconscious soldier to the rail and lower him into the water. No one except Poling himself. He made his decision. He removed his life jacket and strapped it around the unconscious soldier, cinching the buckles tight. Then he grabbed the soldier under the arms and began dragging him toward the rail, uphill, against the increasing slope of the deck, his boots slipping on the ice, his muscles screaming from the effort. It took him 45 seconds to cover 20 feet. The Dorchester groaned and shifted beneath him, settling deeper, listing further. He could feel the ship dying under his feet. He reached the rail. He lifted the unconscious soldier, 170 pounds of dead weight, and pushed him over the side. The soldier hit the water, the life jacket activated, his head stayed above the surface. He floated there, still unconscious, drifting away from the sinking ship. Poling watched him go. Somewhere in the darkness, a Coast Guard sailor on the Escanaba spotted the floating body. The Escanaba pulled the unconscious soldier from the water 11 minutes later. He survived. He never knew who had saved him. He spent the rest of his life trying to find out. At 1:18 a.m., 23 minutes after the torpedo strike, the 4 chaplains stood together near the stern rail of the USAT Dorchester. None of them wore life jackets. George Fox, the Methodist minister who had served in the trenches of France 25 years earlier, who had spent 2 decades preaching about sacrifice and service, who had written to his wife just before sailing that he was ready for whatever came. Alexander Goode, the rabbi with a doctorate in philosophy, who had argued in academic papers that men of different faiths could find common ground, who had spent his ministry building bridges between communities. John Washington, the Catholic priest from Newark, who had begged the army for frontline duty, who had told his superiors that a priest's place was with men in danger. Clark Poling, the Dutch Reformed minister whose father was famous, who had specifically requested that he not receive special treatment, who had written to his wife that he did not expect to return from the war. 4 men, 4 faiths, 4 empty chests where life jackets had been. The Dorchester was going down. They could all feel it, the way the deck was tilting, the way the bow had disappeared, the way the stern was rising higher with every passing second. The ship had perhaps 4 minutes left, maybe less. There was nothing more they could do. No more life jackets to distribute. No more soldiers to pull from flooded compartments. No more words of comfort to offer. They had done everything they could. They had given everything they had. Now there was only one thing left. Lieutenant George Fox reached out and took Rabbi Alexander Goode's hand. Father John Washington took Lieutenant Clark Poling's hand, and the 4 of them linked arms at the rail of the sinking ship, facing the bow, facing the water that was rising to meet them. Sergeant Grady Clark was in the water when he saw them. He had gone over the side 3 minutes earlier, jumping from the port rail with a life jacket secured around his chest, the life jacket that Lieutenant Clark Poling had given him. The cold had hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs, seizing his muscles, turning his limbs into frozen weights. He had forced himself to swim, forced himself to kick away from the sinking ship, forced himself to keep moving even as his body screamed at him to stop. Now he floated in the darkness, 50 yards from the Dorchester, watching her die. The ship was listing at nearly 40 degrees. Her bow was completely submerged, the forward deck buried under black water. Her stern rose high above the surface, the propeller and rudder silhouetted against the stars. The emergency lights had failed completely, but there was enough starlight and enough reflection from the distant Coast Guard searchlights to see the outline of the hull, and the figures still standing on the deck. 4 figures near the stern, standing together at the rail. Clark blinked seawater from his eyes. His vision was blurring from the cold, his eyelids heavy, his thoughts beginning to slow. But he could see them clearly enough to understand what he was witnessing. 4 chaplains, arms linked, standing on a dying ship that they could have escaped. They were not running. They were not jumping. They were not screaming or praying for rescue. They were simply standing there, together, as the water rose around them. At 1:19 a.m., 24 minutes after the torpedo strike, the Dorchester's stern rose another 5 degrees. The 4 chaplains braced themselves against the increasing slope. The deck beneath their feet was nearly vertical now, more ladder than floor. They gripped the rail with their free hands and gripped each other with their linked arms, holding formation against the tilt. George Fox began to pray. His voice was quiet, not meant to carry, not meant to be heard beyond the small circle of 4 men. But the words were familiar, worn smooth by decades of repetition in Methodist churches across Vermont and the eastern seaboard. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Rabbi Alexander Goode listened to the 23rd Psalm in English. Then he added his own voice, in Hebrew, the same psalm, the same words, the language of his ancestors echoing across 3,000 years of faith. Adonai roi, lo exar, bin ot deshe yarbitzaini, al mei menuchot yinahaleni. Father John Washington joined them. His voice carried the cadence of Latin, the Pater Noster, the Our Father, the prayer that Catholics had spoken for 2,000 years in moments of desperation and devotion. Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in caelo et in terra. Lieutenant Clark Poling, the youngest of the 4, closed his eyes. He did not speak Latin or Hebrew. His tradition was Dutch Reformed, Protestant, American, English-speaking. He simply prayed in the language he had used his entire life, the language he had spoken to God since childhood. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. 3 languages, 4 faiths, 1 prayer. The sound carried across the water, fragments of words, syllables in Latin and Hebrew and English, mixing with the groan of dying steel and the crash of waves against the hull. Men in the water heard it. Survivors in lifeboats heard it. They would remember that sound for the rest of their lives. The sound of 4 men praying together as their ship went down. Private First Class John Ladd was in a lifeboat when he saw the chaplains. Ladd had made it off the Dorchester in the first 10 minutes, climbing into one of the few lifeboats that launched successfully. Now he sat in the bow of that boat, packed in with 31 other survivors, watching the transport dive from a distance of perhaps 100 yards. He saw the 4 figures at the stern rail. He saw their arms linked. He saw the water rising around them, climbing the hull, reaching for the deck where they stood. They're not jumping, Ladd said. His voice was barely a whisper. Why aren't they jumping? The man next to him, a merchant seaman who had spent 20 years at sea, understood the answer even if he could not explain it. They gave away their jackets, the seaman said. I saw them, all 4 of them. They gave their jackets to men who didn't have any. Ladd stared at the 4 figures. The water was at their feet now. The deck was tilting past 45 degrees. In another minute, maybe less, the Dorchester would roll completely, and anyone still aboard would be pulled under. They could still jump, Ladd said. They could swim. The cutters are right there. The seaman shook his head. No jacket. Water this cold. They'd be dead in 5 minutes. Then why? Because they're chaplains, the seaman said. That's why. At 1:20 a.m., 25 minutes after the torpedo strike, the Dorchester began her final roll. The ship did not sink bow first, the way most torpedoed vessels did. She rolled to starboard, her list finally exceeding the point of no return. The deck went from steep to vertical to inverted. The stern, which had been rising high above the water, swung sideways and began to drop. The four chaplains felt the roll begin. They had been standing at the rail, braced against the slope, arms linked, voices raised in prayer. Now the rail was no longer beneath their feet. It was beside them, then above them. They did not let go of each other. George Fox tightened his grip on Alexander Goode's arm. He could feel the rabbi's pulse through the wet fabric of his uniform, rapid but steady, the heartbeat of a man who was not afraid. On his other side, John Washington's hand gripped the rail, knuckles white, holding the four of them in place against the ship's rotation. The water came up to meet them. It was not gradual. It was sudden, a wall of black water, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, rising as the deck rolled and the hull rotated. One moment they were standing in the air, the next moment that the water was at their waists, then their chests, then their necks. Fox kept praying. His voice was steady, even as the cold seized his lungs. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Goode's Hebrew continued alongside him, the ancient words mixing with the crash of the waves. Gam ki elech begate salmavet, lo irara ki ataimadi. Washington's Latin rose above the noise of the dying ship. Et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Polling's English joined theirs, all four voices speaking together, all four prayers weaving into one. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. The water reached their mouths, their chins, their noses. They were still praying when the wave closed over their heads. Grady Clark saw them disappear. One moment the four figures were visible at the rail, silhouettes against the stars, arms linked, bodies tilted at impossible angles as the ship rolled. The next moment, there was only water where they had been. The Dorchester's stern continued to rise as the bow dragged her under. For perhaps 30 seconds, the propeller and rudder hung above the surface, black shapes against the night sky. Then they too slipped beneath the waves. At 1:22 a.m., 27 minutes after the German torpedo struck, the USAT Dorchester disappeared from the surface of the North Atlantic. She took 672 men with her. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. For 27 minutes, the night had been filled with noise. The groaning of steel, the crash of waves, the shouts of drowning men, the roar of steam escaping from ruptured pipes. Now there was only the sound of the wind and the lapping of water against debris. The Dorchester left behind a field of wreckage half a mile wide. Wooden planks from shattered lifeboats, life rafts, some occupied, some empty. Debris from the cargo holds, crates, equipment, personal belongings. Bodies. Hundreds of bodies. Some floating face up in life jackets, some floating face down without them, some not floating at all. The survivors were scattered across this field of death, in lifeboats, on rafts, in the water itself. Many were already dying. The 34-degree water was killing them minute by minute, draining the heat from their bodies, slowing their hearts, shutting down their minds. The Coast Guard cutters pushed through the wreckage, their searchlights sweeping across the water, their crews preparing to pull survivors from the sea. The Comanche reached the debris field first. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Ralph Curry, ordered his crew to begin rescue operations immediately. Coast Guardsmen went over the side with ropes and life rings, swimming into the freezing water to grab survivors who could not swim to the ship on their own. The Escanaba arrived minutes later. Her crew used a different technique. Cargo nets draped over the side, allowing survivors to climb up on their own or be pulled up by sailors leaning over the rail. Men who had been in the water for 10 minutes or more were hauled aboard, their bodies rigid, their lips blue, their eyes unfocused. For the next 2 hours, the cutters worked through the wreckage, pulling the living from the dead. They found Grady Clark floating in his life jacket at 1:47 a.m., 25 minutes after the Dorchester went under. He was barely conscious. The cold had slowed his heartbeat to 30 beats per minute. His core temperature had dropped to 91 degrees Fahrenheit. Another 10 minutes in the water, and he would have been dead. The sailors who pulled him aboard the Comanche wrapped him in blankets, carried him below decks, placed him next to a steam pipe to warm him. Clark could not speak. He could not move. He could only lie there, shivering violently, watching the sailors around him work. Later, hours later, when he could finally form words, he told them what he had seen. 4 chaplains, he said. They were standing at the rail. They gave away their life jackets, all 4 of them. Then they linked arms and went down with the ship. The sailor, taking his statement, looked up. All 4 gave away their jackets? All 4, Clark confirmed. They could have jumped. They could have tried to swim. But they stayed. They were praying when the water took them. The sailor wrote it down. He did not comment. He did not need to. The facts spoke for themselves. John Ladd's lifeboat was picked up by the Escanaba at 2:15 a.m. 32 men had climbed into that boat during the sinking. 19 were still alive when the Escanaba reached them. The other 13 had died of hypothermia in the 90 minutes since the Dorchester went down. Sitting upright in the boat, frozen in place, their bodies too cold to sustain life. Ladd was among the living. His memory was clear. He told the same story that Grady Clark had told. 4 chaplains, 4 life jackets given away, 4 men praying together as the ship rolled. Other survivors told the same story. Michael Warish, the young Catholic soldier who had received Father Washington's jacket. Bill Henderson, the construction worker from Kansas who could not swim. Private Martinez, the 19-year-old who had been ordered to take Lieutenant Fox's jacket. The stories matched. The details were consistent. Dozens of witnesses, scattered across the debris field, rescued by different ships, interviewed separately, and all of them describing the same thing. 4 chaplains, 4 faiths, 4 life jackets given away. 4 men dying together at the rail of a sinking ship. The rescue operations continued until dawn. The Comanche, the Escanaba, and the Tampa worked through the wreckage field for more than 4 hours, pulling survivors from the water, from life rafts, from half-swamped lifeboats. Their crews worked without rest, leaning over frozen rails, reaching into 34-degree water, hauling up men who could no longer help themselves. By 0600 hours on February 3, 1943, the cutters had recovered everyone they could find alive. The final count, 230 survivors, 672 dead. Of the 672 who perished, most died of hypothermia rather than drowning. The life jackets that the chaplains and others had distributed kept heads above water, but they could not keep bodies warm. Men floated in the darkness, their life jackets holding them at the surface, while the cold slowly stopped their hearts. The cutters found dozens of bodies floating upright, life jackets properly secured, faces frozen in expressions of exhausted peace. Among those 672 dead were 4 Army chaplains: Lieutenant George L. Fox, Lieutenant Alexander D. Goode, Lieutenant John P. Washington, and Lieutenant Clark V. Poling. Their bodies were never recovered. The survivors reached Greenland on February 4, 1943. They were transferred to military hospitals, treated for hypothermia and frostbite, interviewed by intelligence officers about the attack. the story of the four chaplains emerged piece by piece. From Grady Clark and John Ladd, from Michael Warish and Bill Henderson, from Private Martinez and dozens of others who had witnessed fragments of what happened on the Dorchester's deck. The accounts were consistent. Four chaplains had moved through the sinking ship, calming soldiers, directing traffic, distributing life jackets. When the life jackets ran out, each chaplain had removed his own and given it to a soldier without one. Then the four of them had linked arms at the rail and gone down with the ship, praying together in 3 languages. The Army moved quickly to honor them. On December 19, 1944, nearly 2 years after the sinking, Lieutenant George L. Fox, Lieutenant Alexander D. Goode, Lieutenant John P. Washington, and Lieutenant Clark V. Poling were posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration. They also received the Purple Heart. The citations were identical in their essential language. Each man had voluntarily surrendered his life preserver to a soldier who had none, and had remained aboard the sinking ship, calming the panic-stricken passengers and crew and aiding in their escape. Congress considered awarding them the Medal of Honor. The proposal failed on a technicality. The Medal of Honor required the recipient to have been under enemy fire at the moment of their heroic action. The four chaplains had been killed by a torpedo, not by gunfire. The distinction seemed absurd to the men who had survived that night. But regulations were regulations. The legacy of the four chaplains grew in the years after the war. In 1948, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp bearing their images, the first time in American history that a stamp had honored a rabbi. The stamp showed 4 faces, 4 faiths, 4 men who had proven that the boundaries between religions meant nothing when lives were at stake. In 1951, President Truman dedicated a chapel in their honor at Grace Baptist Church in Philadelphia. The Chapel of the Four Chaplains became a national shrine to interfaith cooperation, visited by thousands of Americans each year. In 1960, Congress authorized the creation of a special medal, the Four Chaplains Medal, to honor their sacrifice. It was not the Medal of Honor, but it was something else. A recognition that what Fox, Goode, Washington, and Poling had done transcended ordinary categories of military valor. The medal bore 4 faces and 4 words: unity, sacrifice, brotherhood, service. Their families received the medals in a ceremony at the Pentagon. Isidore Goode, Alexander's father, accepted his son's medal alongside the parents and widows of the other 3 chaplains. 4 families, 4 faiths, bound together by the sacrifice their sons had made. The survivors carried the story forward. Grady Clark spoke about the 4 chaplains for the rest of his life. He visited schools, churches, synagogues, and veterans' halls, describing what he had witnessed from the water. 4 figures at the rail, arms linked, praying as the ship went down. He never forgot the sound of their voices carrying across the waves. John Ladd became an advocate for interfaith dialogue, inspired by what he had seen that night. A Methodist, a rabbi, a Catholic, and a Dutch Reformed minister, standing together, dying together, proving that faith was bigger than any single tradition. Michael Warish married his girl, had his children, lived his 58 extra years. He attended 4 chaplains' memorial services every February 3rd until he was too old to travel. He never stopped thanking God and Father John Washington for those years. The men who had received the chaplains' life jackets understood the weight of that gift. They had been chosen to live. They had been given decades that the chaplains would never have. They spent those decades trying to be worthy of the sacrifice. On February 3rd, 1993, 50 years after the sinking of the Dorchester, a ceremony was held at the Pentagon. The few remaining survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, gathered to remember the 4 chaplains. They stood in silence as the names were read: Fox, Goode, Washington, Poling. They listened as speakers described the events of that night: the torpedo, the flooding, the chaos, the calm voices of 4 men distributing life jackets in the darkness. One survivor was asked to describe what he remembered most clearly. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "They weren't afraid. That's what I remember. The ship was going down. They were going to die, and they weren't afraid. They were at peace." He paused. I've spent 50 years trying to understand that. How do you face death with that kind of calm? How do you give away your only chance at survival and smile while you're doing it? He shook his head. I think it's because they believed. Not just in God, though they did. They believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed that what they were doing mattered, that saving one more life was worth their own. He looked at the audience, the veterans, the families, the dignitaries. That's what I learned from them. That's what I've tried to live by ever since. Your life isn't just for you. It's for what you can give to others. The USAT Dorchester lies in 900 feet of water, 150 miles south of Greenland. The wreck has never been explored. The cold and the depth and the currents make recovery impossible. The 672 men who went down with her, including 4 chaplains who gave away their life jackets and linked arms at the rail, remain where they fell, in the darkness of the North Atlantic. But they are not forgotten. Every February 3rd, Americans gather in churches and synagogues and community centers across the country to remember 4 Chaplains' Day. They tell the story of Fox, Goode, Washington, and Poling. 4 men from 4 faiths who proved, in 27 minutes of chaos and sacrifice, that courage has no denomination. They gave away their life jackets. They linked arms at the rail. They prayed together in Latin, Hebrew, and English as the water rose around them. And they went down together. 4 chaplains, 4 faiths, 1 sacrifice. If this story earned your time, hit the like button. It costs nothing and tells YouTube this video matters. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Accounts of real people facing impossible situations with nothing but faith and nerve. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Did anyone in your family serve in the Second World War? Did anyone in your family serve as a chaplain or receive help from one? This community spans the globe. From California to Tasmania, from veterans to history students, from believers to skeptics. Let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. These stories deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.